inventory shortage to inventory glut. P.S. Subramaniam is a partner in the strategic operations and performance practice of Kearney. Hello, P.S.
Hello.
Thank you for being with me today. What is the situation right now with regard to U.S. electronics inventory levels?
Well, Robert, we are coming off of a shortage period, just a few months ago. But as we look forward, we are pretty sure that what was a component shortage in electronics is actually fast becoming way too much inventory for companies to manage going forward.
And what do you mean by what types of components or products? Is it microprocessors? Is it chips? Is it other stuff? What kind of components right now are most in oversupply?
Well, it was initially the chipsets. If you can imagine, most companies 3 years ago said, go out in the hills and get as many chipsets as you can lay your
Yeah.
hands on because they're going to be in short supply. But the only way companies are set up to do that is to get all of the components that make the entire finished product. Because the way the systems work, the way the planning systems work, and the way the MRP works, is very difficult to tune very specific components you want to have excess inventory of. And so companies by default ended up getting everything. And everything meant also getting things that were not in short supply. And so we see an oversupply of everything, and in particular, chipsets as well, as the overall demand has come down 20 to 30% this year.
It doesn't seem that long since we were in the midst of that shortage to the point where some people have felt like they were even panicking. They were saying, "Oh my goodness, this is going to completely destroy our ability to continue to create high tech products." The auto industry was said to be slowing down production because they didn't have enough chips because they had ceded their share to electronics game makers, and it was just a horrible situation. And now all of a sudden, it's like, did they overreact? Did we panic in a way that maybe we shouldn't have?
Well, I think we've seen boom and bust cycles in the past. So
Yeah.
actually, our hypothesis is that this is really a way of thinking about supply chain planning and building the muscle to understand when are we on the leading edge of a shortage versus when are we on the trailing edge of a shortage and on the leading edge of an excess glut situation. So if you think about, kind of the way we think about it, the way we think analytically about it is this term called inventory momentum, right? Not having, instead of thinking about absolute amount of inventory, we think about the rate of change of inventory and how does it match the demand cycle. So
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning of this year, we tend to think of some of these semiconductor companies to be the canaries in the coal mine. So if you looked at Intel or you looked at Samsung or you looked at some of these electronics chipset companies that were announcing their earnings, including TI, well, they started announcing a demand shortfall at the beginning of 2023. And when these companies have a demand shortfall because the channel inventory is too much, it takes a while or a lag period before consumer electronics companies perceive the same demand shortfall. And so we see the cycle playing out that starting 2023, Intel, I think, announced a 25% earnings hit in terms of their forward-looking forecast. And now we see that, resulting in ever more inventory piled up in consumer electronics companies because now they're dealing with all of the components that they've ordered being too much in supply.
This concept of inventory momentum interests me, however. It feels like you're saying that what you do is you assess not just the amount of inventory, but kind of the direction it's going. But I don't think you would want to say that just because it is at a certain point right now that we can necessarily extrapolate that into the future, that that it's this way, it's going to be that way. So how do we get out of the fallacious thinking that what's happening now is going to be happening in 6 months or a year or 2 years from now?
Yeah, which is why we kind of linked it back to the capability or the brains behind supply chain planning, because there's always going to be the excess and the glut are two sides of the same coin, and there's
Mhm.
always going to be this balance needed. And practitioners, particularly supply chain leaders, have to build the capability within their supply chain planning teams to look analytically beyond the current quarter. So instead of focusing everything on a binary switch of I have too much or I have too little, look out beyond the current quarter, beyond the products you're building and selling right now. Look out 2, 3, 4 quarters and look at a variety of different indicators, both leading and lagging, to make a determination of how do you want to throttle the supply chain. because many companies actually, especially through the pandemic, had invested a lot of resources in building more flexible supply chains. And so now, you talk about regional supply chains, and people have spent a lot of effort and resources in reducing lead times. So how do you put that to effective use? Well, it's by looking out 2 3 quarters and making a judgment call every month in the PSYOP cycle and the traditional SNOP cycles, to build that capability to look a little bit ahead and recognize that you're always going to be catching up. And so, how soon do you catch up, and how do you allow the market dynamics to not have too much of something or too little of something, is really the science behind this discipline.
There's an ironic implication here, and that is that manufacturers making some of the most sophisticated products on the planet, their planning aspect of it was anything but sophisticated. That I find that really interesting, that your implication is that they're lagging way behind on the sophistication of their planning, but they now have to kind of step up. Also, what was happening in the height of the shortage was that everybody scrambled, and in the case of the CHIPS Act, at a government level, to start building fabs, chip plants here in the United States, putting billions of dollars aside for that purpose. Are we now saying that that was an overreaction, or is it important to continue that effort in going forward and trying to understand inventory momentum?
It is, let's take chipsets in particular. That industry has always had boom and bust cycles.
Right.
Demand is certainly cyclical. Even today, we expect 2023 to be a time when people burn off channel inventory, but we expect demand to come back by mid next year for the same chipsets. And we expect demand to surpass far in advance of consumption today. And so the investment, if you think about the investment in a fab, it takes a period of a decade for a fab to be fully operational from the time the investment is decided, because it takes a long time to build and tune production, and it requires highly skilled labor to do all of that. And so we believe that these temporary boom and bust cycles are not a substitute to the long-term investment in electronics. I think it's a foregone conclusion in the consumer of today that we're going to be surrounded by electronics in the first, I mean, for the next generation, at a
Right.
minimum. Electronics are going to run every part of our lives. Artificial intelligence is going to determine the music we listen to when we go for a morning jog, and there's going to be thousands more chipsets in the cars we drive of tomorrow. And so the fact that we will need more electronics over the decade in the future, or decades to come, is a near certainty. I
Yeah.
think this glut versus excess is a real specific point in time, and also about the specific technology that's in use today, because the technology continues to evolve. The chipset that's used in the products that are being launched today are different from the chipsets that were used even 2 years ago.
Right. Does
And so,
that mean, though, that a lot of the glut right now consists of outdated or obsolete components that just have to be scrapped and can't be used to meet future demand?
yeah, well, that's inevitable. There's going to be some that are universally applicable. If you think about kind of the capacitors and the resistors and standard electronics, well, these are catalog products that will continue to live, beyond any particular cycle. But there are going to be some products, particularly related to power electronics. The technology around how do devices consume less power? How do you make the battery go longer? Things of that kind are continuously in innovation, and so certainly those will have disruption cycles where there'll be a new generation of chipsets that supersede and are superior in performance to the generations of chipsets that came before them.
So I hear you saying, don't take your eye off the ball in terms of long-term future planning and building new plants, but at the same time, manufacturers need to adopt a much shorter term view as well, to the point where, as you're saying, actually monthly reassessments of inventory requirements. Is that indeed what you're calling for here?
That's right. And actually, we see a lot of companies already doing this in terms of more frequent planning cycles and higher skill sets, access to data beyond what's within the company. So if you look at external trends of consumer reactions, consumer patterns, geopolitical risks, and things of that kind. So, there's also technology investments that there's tools that allow you to look at beyond just numerical data that can enable planners to make decisions. So all of these things are enormously important in controlling. It's like throttling the yardstick or the joystick of a plane. How do you adjust the altitude to ensure that you don't have turbulence is a
Yeah.
continual thing that needs to be done.
How important is it to factor into the whole mix the idea of environmental responsibility and the need to reduce or mitigate e-waste, electronic waste?
Oh, phenomenally important. So if you think about in the past, when companies had too much of something, especially something that was now outdated and couldn't be used in products anymore, the method of disposition was simply burying it under the ground. Well, as the volume of these wastes have increased, that cannot anywhere, it cannot be done safely and it cannot be done in a way that doesn't pollute the environment. So it has now become an enormously problematic conversation, especially if you have the glut of computers, servers, network equipment from generations ago that are no longer useful. How do you try to recycle? How do you try to reuse many of these things without necessarily burying them under the ground? And so the topic of e-waste is a phenomenally important topic as we talk about disposition of excess inventory.
Well, it seems boom and bust isn't going away, but it sounds like what you're proposing here can help manufacturers do a much better job of dealing with it without overreacting or underreacting and smoothing out demand and getting a better sense, better handle on their inventory needs going forward. P.S. Subramaniam, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this critical issue. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Robert. Pleasure to be on the discussion today.